Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Cohen, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can write a high-scoring essay on the new SAT, also called the Redesigned SAT. Now, if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume that you already know a bit about the essay, what it looks like, what the question asks. If you don't, before watching this, pause the video now, go over to College Board's website, and look at a sample essay prompt or two. I also provide a link to where you can to those essays in the article on my blog, How to Write the New SAT Essay. Now, because the new essay is optional, a lot of you might be wondering whether or not you should take it. I would strongly urge everyone taking the SAT to take the essay. A lot of colleges don't care about the essay, don't ask for it, but a lot of schools do require or recommend the essay. And you can find a list of which schools want the essay on College Board's website. Again, I link to that list in the blog article on my blog, SAT ACT blog. Now, even if you read that list and you say, well, the schools I'm interested in don't ask for the essay, first of all, their policy could change. And secondly, there might be other schools you haven't thought of that further in the college application process you become aware of and you want to apply to, and you might not be able to apply to them if you haven't taken the essay. So, by all means, it's just 50 extra minutes. It's a little bit of extra prep work, but it's worth taking because you're giving yourself more options in terms of schools you can apply to. How can you write a great essay? What's the first thing to do? Well, the first thing you should do, it is important that you read the entire passage, but before reading the passage, take a look at the question that follows the passage. This is really important because hidden in the question is the main point of the passage. The question will say something like, one question says, for instance, write an essay in which you explain how Paul Bogard builds an argument to persuade his audience that natural darkness should be preserved. To persuade his audience that natural darkness should be preserved, that's the main idea. Whatever he or she is writing the article to persuade the audience of, that is the main idea. So now once you know the main idea, thankfully College Board does a lot of the hard work for you. Now that you know the main idea, you're ready to read the passage. As you read through the passage, keep that main idea in mind, and always remind yourself that everything the author is arguing has to, in some way, relate back to that main idea, and really try and prove that main idea. As you read, you're looking for ways, that the author tries to persuade you of that main idea. These ways can be evidence, they can be logic or reason, and they can also be stylistic or persuasive elements. So you want to look for the big, really important ones. Anytime you see some of these, mark them, make a little annotation. So when you're finished reading the passage, you can look back quickly and see the persuasive elements that you're then going to write about. It's also really important that you have a good understanding of what the passage is saying. Now, that main idea hidden in the question is going to help you get a better sense of what the passage is saying. But if you finish the passage and there's still parts you don't understand, go back and reread them. They'll often make more sense in context after you've read the whole passage. And secondly, you have 50 minutes, so you have enough time to go back and reread those parts. It's really important that you understand what's happening, because one of your 3 scores, the reading score, is going to evaluate how well you seem to grasp the passage. Once you finish the passage, you know what it's saying, you've noted all the persuasive devices the author uses, then you're ready to make your outline. And a really good structure for your essay is an opening paragraph that describes your thesis. Always come out and state your thesis in the opening paragraph. The thesis is just your central argument. So for instance, your thesis might say something like, the author uses statistical evidence, ironic language, and emotional appeals to persuade the reader that darkness should be preserved. Then you're going to want to have 2 or 3 paragraphs, and each of these paragraphs should be devoted to explaining in detail one of the parts of your thesis. So if the thesis argues that the writer uses, again, let's say statistical evidence, ironic language, and emotional appeals, the second paragraph can be about specific examples of statistical evidence, the third ironic language, the fourth emotional appeals. When you're finished, you want to have a concluding paragraph where you just restate your thesis, although you want to restate it in slightly different language than you used in the opening paragraph. After you briefly note down this structure of the essay, paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're ready to write the essay. Spend, the rest of the 50 minutes writing the essay, except you want to leave a couple of minutes at the end to go back and reread what you've written to correct any spelling or grammatical mistakes. Let's talk about the thesis a little bit more. Make sure when you write the thesis that you're describing what the author does to persuade the reader of his or her point. Don't talk about what the author fails to do. Your job is just to point out the ways, the devices they use to be persuasive. You also want to maintain neutrality with regard to the argument. So you don't want to come out and say this argument is right, this argument is wrong, even if you feel really passionately about the argument and you agree or disagree with it. You want to stay neutral. You want to limit yourself to only saying what the devices are that the writer uses to be persuasive about their argument. You don't want to say whether they, did a poor job, whether they're right or wrong. Stay neutral. Now let's talk about the examples a little bit more. When you provide these examples, you want to always tie them back to your central argument about how the author is using those specific techniques to persuade the reader. It's easy to get caught up in describing the techniques, be it evidence or emotional appeals. It's easy to get caught up in describing them and forget to conclude by saying the author uses these to convince the reader that. But you always need to come back to your main argument and link those examples to your main argument that the author's trying to convince you of this thing. The SAT wants to see that you're using techniques, devices, examples that are really important to the argument the author's making. So don't talk about things that seem really marginal or insignificant. Try and focus on the main devices that the author uses to make their point. That said, you definitely don't and probably shouldn't, you don't need to and you probably shouldn't talk about everything the author does to convince you of his or her point. You want to stick to, a couple of specific examples, and you really want to go into detail with each example. So if you're going to talk about evidence and you're going to talk about emotional appeals, you want to talk about maybe one or two specific examples of each of those, and you want to go in depth when you talk about them. So talk about how they use them, why the way they use them is so effective. They're really looking for that depth of analysis. If you briefly mention in passing, if you say the author uses evidence, he gives this fact, this fact, this fact, that's not bad, but it won't get you a great score. It's better to go really in depth with a few examples. Similarly, you want to avoid making really broad claims that are difficult to prove. So let me give you an example of what that might look like. By discussing tragedy, the author moves the reader. Really broad, general, we can't really prove that. So instead, talk about specific ways in which something is effective. So what we might say instead is, when the author discusses tragedy, she chooses specific examples aimed at resonating with her audience. Since her audience is American, for example, she discusses the American tragedy of September 11th. So now I'm making a good point about how the author is being persuasive, but I'm doing it in a very clear way with very specific evidence and details that back up my point, instead of making a more broad and more difficult to prove claim. Something else that's really important is mentioning how different details and arguments fit together, how they relate to one another, and how they fit into the author's larger argument. This is something the SAT evaluates. It's in their scoring rubric. So if you want to get the highest possible score, it's really important to talk about how the different things you're talking about relate in the author's argument. You should also avoid directly quoting from the text too much. You know, the SAT, they're giving you one of the 3 scores is evaluating how well you understood the article. And part of how they figure that out is by listening to you paraphrase the argument, put it in your own words. So unless you're talking, and in general in writing, you don't want to directly quote something too much. You want to provide a direct quote when you want to talk about the language being used or the way the sentence is structured. But otherwise, it's generally best to avoid quoting something directly and instead put it in your own words if you're able to. And this will really help boost your reading score. One last thing about the reading score is that essays that get the highest reading scores are usually pretty lengthy. And that's just because, the reading score evaluates how well you understood the article. And the more you say about the article, the more clearer it becomes clearer to your grader that you understand more about the passage. So plan the essay, spend some time reviewing it before you're finished, but otherwise spend the remaining time working on the essay. Generally, the more you write, the better you're going to do, because that writing more allows you to go more in depth with your examples and show that you and do a better job of showing you understand the article. Now, again, the SAT asks you to look at persuasive elements like evidence, reasoning, and style or persuasive elements, they just call them. You don't need to address all 3 of these categories. It's okay often better if you just address 2 in depth. And every essay is going to be different. Every passage is different and uses different techniques. But some of the most common techniques that you're likely to see on the test are on passages are in terms of evidence, use of historical facts, statistics, or anecdotes. In terms of reasoning, applying a general rule to a specific case, deducing a general rule from specific cases, or using logic to rule a possibility in or out. And in terms of stylistic elements, you'll often see the author trying to sound like the reader to make the reader more sympathetic to his or her argument. Specific word choice and irony or sarcasm and repetition is another big one they might use to really drive a point home and persuade you of it. So there's all sorts of different devices they can use. These are common ones. And if you want to see these in the form of a list, you can check out my article on the SAT ACT blog, How to Write the New SAT Essay. Now, there is a writing score, which evaluates how well you write, your grammar, your style, and you're going to be studying grammar for the writing and language portion of the SAT, so try and use what you're learning for that section, try and apply that to your own writing when you write the essay. You want to make sure that your writing flows smoothly. One sentence and idea should flow and transition smoothly to the next. Each paragraph you want to begin with a good transition from the preceding paragraph, so you might start a new paragraph by saying, similar to her use of historical evidence, the author employs statistical evidence to argue the economy's strong. You also want to connect separate clauses or phrases with words that most explicitly show how those separate clauses relate. So words like thus, therefore, nevertheless, for example, in contrast, basically you use connecting words that are going to show how different parts really do connect. The SAT also looks for a varied sentence structure. So use different structures. Don't say, John is hungry, John is tired, John is not having a good day. Say, John is hungry and tired. As you might guess, he is not having a good day. So, you don't want to start each sentence or consecutive paragraph with the same word. You really want to mix things up. You also want to use the active voice instead of the passive voice. The passive voice would be like saying, the apple was eaten. Active voice would be, the boy ate the apple. So passive, you have a form of the verb to be. The apple was eaten. Then make that active instead. Replace the was, the to be verb, with the verb that shows the actual action in the sentence. What's happening in the sentence? Eating. The boy's eating. So say the boy ate the apple instead of the apple was eaten. Lastly, the SAT wants you to write formally. They evaluate you on this. So that means not using contractions. Don't write that, THAT apostrophe S, write that is, write those out fully. Try not to use cliches. Try not to use anything too colloquial or spoken, like he got a lot of money. Say he received a lot of money. And you also want to use advanced vocabulary whenever appropriate. So you don't have to do this, but if you do know some advanced vocabulary words, it makes your writing stronger. That said, if you're not really sure about the meaning of a particular word, it's better not to use it than to use it incorrectly. So now that you know all that, and you can review it, on the article on my blog, you can also print that out if you want. You want to apply all that to practice essays. It's really important to write time practice essays. And you want to use official prompts from the SAT because they're just always more accurate than what you'll see from a test prep company. So you can find, I have a link. You can find some of these on the College Board's website, and I have links to where you can find specific ones in my blog article. If you found this video helpful, please like it, share it, or subscribe to the channel, all of which will help me reach more people looking for this type of information. Thanks.